Now this build is beyond broken. It obliterates 2,000 corruption. It one-shots all bosses. It shits Uber Aberoth in the mouth. And despite having the most insane damage imaginable and hitting for hundreds of millions, it's still completely immortal, easy to hell to play, and it's easy to get online as well. And how is this even possible? It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Well, there are a lot of important interactions in this build, most of them stemming from your gear and idols. So let's check them out first, shall we? Fortunately for you, they're easy to obtain. I'd also like to shout out the Chinese community here for coming up with most of these interactions. And as per usual, I'll mention that this build is indeed on the seasonal realm, so there are no offline shenanigans going on. The general idea of the build here is that we're going to use our Shadow Rend, Explosive Trap, and Passive Tree to generate Dusk Shrouds for us. We're then going to have our Dusk Shroud boost the living shit out of Umbral Blades, both via the skill tree, but more importantly, via our idols. We have 8% extra damage per Dusk Shroud and idols, and we can get upwards of 120 stacks. So yeah, you do the math of how much we inflate our damage via these idols alone. And it also goes without saying, the Dusk Shrouds also makes us immortal, as they boost our dodge chance to the moon. Alright, but how does the Dusk Shroud generation actually work? Well, the latter two are from the skill tree and passives, so we'll get back to those. But the most important way of obtaining Dusk Shrouds comes from our gear and the Doppelganger set, because via our helmet, we obtain Dusk Shrouds every time we consume a shadow. And this is why we want to use Shadow Rend. It consumes shadows via Shadow Massacre and then generates them back again via Unending Twilight and its inherent Shadow Generation. When we pair this with the Doppelganger Relic as well, that generates more shadow as we consume then we are set to have shitloads of shadows at all times. Ideally, you would shatter these set pieces and put them onto an actual proper gear piece, but you need both the Helmet Shadow Consume roll and the Relic Shadow Consume roll to be maxed out, so you're going to have to use a Rune of Havoc to get it to a T7 roll in that case. It's a bit of a hassle, so equipping the actual set gear is fine as well. As you can see, my gear is far from perfect, and I'll likely be pushing to 5,000 corruption with ease. Alright, then we move on to the other gear. For Amulet, Xithara's is just fucking insane, granting us upwards of 30% multiplicative damage. It's also cheap, so we can slam throwing damage and physical penetration on it. For our weapons, we want a one-handed sword and a dagger, because we're going to utilize the Jorman's set bonus for 20% extra damage when dual-wielding different weapon types. Here you don't need a T7 set affix roll though, so this gear piece is easily crafted. I'd focus on getting as much cooldown reduction and throwing damage as possible here. And going back to the weapons, by far the most important is that you grab shitloads of melee attack speed, because this is going to boost your Dusk Shroud generation, but also your Shadow Cascade damage, which will do most of your damage when running monoliths. For the other weapon, we grab a Traitor's Tongue for the skill ranks, attack speed, and base crit chance. With this weapon, and the base crit chance from our relic, you barely need any crit chance because we're going to utilize flow and crit vulnerability on bosses. If you want more damage when doing monoliths though, then by all means grab more crit chance, but they're so easy that I don't really give a shit about those. Other than slamming attack speed though, you really want some physical penetration. I'm currently lacking a lot unfortunately, and then crit multiplier and lastly shred. You don't really need any increased damage mods because we're going to inflate the living shit out of that multiplier via our idols. Alright. And then for our rings we have Legends Entwined, which is our one primordial item. We use this since it counts as an equipped item set, meaning we don't need the second gear piece for Jormans to get the bonus. It also has some nice stats. For the second ring, you can either go for something like this or just a good exalted ring to cap your resistance and crit avoidance. The most important stat is throwing damage, though, as we want the damage and mana cost reduction. Alright, and then we have an interesting piece, the chest. Here we can get a lot of insane mods. The most important ones are ward on shadow creation, as this is alone what grants us our massive ward, and then secondly the +1 to maximum shadows, which you get from slamming the doppelganger set bonus. The chance to gain extra Dusk shroud is great as well, but you'll have to seal one of your mods to slot it in. I'd also like to mention that you can grab ward when you create a shadow on your helmet as well, which would allow you to push upwards of 10,000 ward with good rolls. Alright, and then finally, we want a pair of gloves with throwing damage and yet another extra shadow, so we can get a total of 7, and lastly, the tabby of Dusk and Dawn sneakers. These are kinda shit when you look at the stats, but that's not why we use them. They generate an extra shadow per shadow rendcast, which is why I'm using them. They're also cheap, allowing you to slam a cooldown reduction mod on them, because that's important. You want cooldown reduction here, on your belt, and you also get some on your ring. And the reason this is important is because we want to reduce the cooldown on Smoke Bomb as much as possible, as the aim is to stand within it at all times. More on that later though, because now it's time for the idols. These are more or less what carries the entire build. You need increased damage per Dusk shroud here. I'm getting somewhere in the ballpark of 5,000% increased damage from my umbral blades here, and you can gain a lot more with a better altar. Here you're just looking for one with increased prefix bonuses and as many retracted slots as possible. You grab umbral blade damage and then you can fill out with armor shred effect or anything useful. Then, for the final slot, I'm grabbing this one. For some extra throwing damage and Shadow Cascade damage, as Shadow Cascade will be your main damage dealer in monoliths. Alright, and then the blessings. Here we go for crit multi, resistances, armor, and more armor before finishing it off with some mana. And speaking of mana, let's check out how we actually sustain our mana with this build. Because if you don't watch this part, then firstly, fuck you, and secondly, the build won't work. Because as you can see, you'll drain your mana quite rapidly, and that's because we need Sinister Plan to sustain our mana. As long as we stay within our Smoke Bomb, we'll gain most of our mana back. The remaining mana we get via our Shadow Cascade, returning mana per active shadow. Other than spawning shadows, we have Shadow Rend for consuming them via Shadow Massacre, as mentioned earlier, and regenerate them via Unending Twilight. We also have more Dusk Shroud generation here each time our shadows hit an enemy, along with generating ward for us and these two important nodes. Night's Approach throws the shadow 5 meters away from us, as you'd otherwise just drop them on top of yourself. Betrayal of Flash also grants them aimbot, which is great in monoliths. Finally, we just grab the final nodes for attack speed and frailty, as we're just using it as a supportive skill. Next, it's time for Umbral Blades, and how we do our Wombo combo to one-shot bosses. Our Umbral Remnant will leave Umbral Blades on the ground every time one of our shadows are consumed. We're then going to use the Umbral Blade skill to recall these for shitloads of damage at once. All the other passives here and then simply used to boost our damage. In particular, to boost the recall damage, as we don't give a shit about the thrown out damage. After that, it's time for Smoke Bomb, where the most important part is that it reduces our mana cost when standing within it. But it also grants us shitloads of damage via Smoke Blades. We're also using it as our traversal skill, which also reduces its cooldown. And finally, we're going to cheese content by granting us Silver Shrouds for a 100% dodge. Pair that with the fact that we get upwards of 80 to 90% dodge from Dusk Shroud stacking, and it's extremely rare that enemies actually hit us. Alright, and next up is Shadow Cascade, which is our main monolith damage ability. Here we're grabbing as much damage as we can, along with Dagger Dance and Porcupine's Wrath, which throws a, pun intended, throwing damage tag onto our skill instead of melee, which in turn allows us to scale the umbral blades, damage, and shadow cascade damage from just throwing damage. We then have leveraged momentum, which is one of our main damage scalers, scaling damage via attack speed, along with Fight in the Shadows, which is our main mana generator, and lastly Careful Assault, to double our shadow cascade damage, as we're always going to have more than 4 shadows up. Yummers. And for the final skill of the day, we have Explosive Trap. This is probably the least interesting and least useful skill, as I'm mainly using it for the Smoke Traps node to generate more Dusk shrouds, along with getting some chill from Flash Frozen. Other than that though, it's mainly just about scaling the number of explosive traps for more Dusk shrouds. If you want, you can ditch this one to spec into Decoy if you want for more defenses, Armor Shred, and Crit Multiplier. Or you can go for Shift if you want more one-shotting capabilities, but it will make the Wombo combo more difficult. Or just go for Explosive Trap for more Dusk shrouds and leave it at that. Great job, friends. Skills complete. Let's check out the passives now, shall we? And then I'll teach you bunch of brain-dead donkeys how to actually play the build. Starting us right off, we go for the usual nodes in the Rogue tree. Some flat damage, damage reduction, twin blades to dual wield, and some dodge rating. Next, we're going to go for some good shit in the Bladedancer tree. We first have Cloak of Shadows and Resilience, so that we may grab Veil of Night for a 30% chance to gain Dusk shrouds on hit, along with some attack speed. A lovely node. We then grab some more flat damage and Flow. This one's rather important, especially if you don't have a lot of crit chance on your gear. First, it's going to double your Umbral Blades damage when we pair it with Flow. Secondly, it generates more attack speed for us. And lastly, it helps us cap our crit chance for Umbral Blades if we're not capped yet. Alright, and how does Flow actually work for the newbies? Well, the 5th skill you use, gain the Flow damage bonus. You can see Flow down here, and if you use Smoke Bomb, Shadow Rend, and 2 Umbral Blades, then you gain the damage bonus on your recall, which is what we're going for. Alright, and then we go for Perfection and Confidence for a lot of damage and base dodge rating, along with some more attack speed and crit chance if you need it. Since you have a sword and dagger, you get 20% crit chance per node here, so if you ever need crit chance, then just dump a few nodes here. Then we have Crit Vulnerability, which is a 25% crit chance bonus you slap on top of your current crit chance that we quickly stack up. We also have Cloaked Reaper, which is yet another way of getting a free dodge. We have Spellbreaker for instant frailty application, and lastly, some Armor Shred, an extra Shadow and Dusk shroud generation, and some extra crit multiplier. Alright. Now in the Falcon tree, we simply have a bit of more damage. The Marksman tree is more interesting, however, because here we find a lot of extra Armor Shred, along with 16% damage as long as we don't get hit, and a whopping 10% damage reduction. Lovely. And with that, we're done with this shit. Let's see how you're supposed to run monoliths and one-tap bosses with the build now, shall we? For mapping, it's easy peasy. You drop down a smoke bomb, you spam your Shadow Rend, and repeat. For low monoliths, you can skip a lot of packs and run around in between smoke bombs, but I do not recommend this in high-tier monoliths because you'll get one shot. Rather, you only stand within the smoke bomb and move with the smoke bomb itself. You also have Decoy that you can use when needed if you're in trouble. For bossing though, it's quite different. Here we are going for as many Dusk shroud stacks and debuffs on the boss as possible. When doing this, you want to be spawning your shadows either on top of behind the boss, because every shadow will drop an Umbral Blade, and when you recall them, you want to ensure that you hit the boss with the recalled blades. You also need to ensure that you time your flow stacks perfectly. Since I know most of my viewers are fucking brain dead, I made it easy for you to do this though. As long as you're spamming your smoke bomb and shadow rend, you'll have 2 flow stacks up. And once you feel that you've stacked up enough Dusk shrouds to one-shot the boss, you just cast Umbral Blades 3 times in a row, and you should get 5 flow stacks and kill the boss with ease. And with that, I'm done. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.